Okay, chapter 24, the Baroque in Italy and Spain. We're going to be talking about just those two areas in particular, and then the next chapter we'll talk about Baroque in Northern Europe. And Baroque is the term that stuck with this period of time from 1600 to 1699. It went through a whole bunch of different alterations of definition, but again, like most of this time frame, the words themselves aren't really generated until a couple hundred years later, like the best way to describe these time periods. So the term Baroque came up loosely during the 17th century, being 1600 to 1699. But it really didn't stick until much later. And again, it was just another way of comparing to classical Renaissance artists, just like we saw with the Mannerist. The Mannerist terminology came as a comparison to the counterparts of the classical artists during the Renaissance. So your main ones that we've kind of discussed is Gothic, Mannerism, as well as now Baroque, and that this type of art form and this definition of art form was again derived from comparing to the classical artists of the Renaissance. So they were the epicenter, right? These classical artists like Raphael and Michelangelo and Leonardo and Donatello, and then everything else is just kind of derivative of that. So that's where this terminology comes from. Now, the thing is with Baroque is it has multiple new styles, and it's very diverse. And we're not going to find that one channel of conventionality is going to run through this type of artwork. Unlike the classical artists of the Renaissance, there is an even line, kind of an axial line that runs through all of it in similarity, focusing on new sciences, orthodox religious themes, Christian themes, reinvention of antiquity through the Greco-Roman interest, as well as naturalism, and really bringing in the natural world around you and observing and being a human observer and taking control of that observation and then applying it sometimes in a contrived way upon the canvas or within the sculpture or in the architecture. During this time, though, we're going to see complexity and drama, lots of complexity. Versus the Renaissance, it was very much kind of a shift away from drama and emotion and more about rationality and logic. And now here we're going to move into a very dramatic disposition in the artwork. And a lot of that has to do, at least with Italy and Spain, which were heavily controlled, completely controlled by the papacy, which is the Vatican, the Pope, and the Catholic Church. And during this time, we have a counter-reformation trying to push back the Protestant reformers, and that means the artwork needs to be a visual component of ecstasy towards religiosity to God, and that the Catholic Church is the avenue in which you're supposed to follow to get there. So as the Protestant sects are starting to develop their own placement in Northern Europe, which we'll talk about in chapter 25, here in chapter 24, we're going to talk about how prominent the Catholic Church is from 1600 to 1699 during this Counter-Reformation. And all this artwork in sculpture, painting, and architecture is all going to be derivative of this, the Pope's desire to push, and the papacy's desire to push religious themes in a very dramatic and complex way, so that it shows that they are the staple heads of the activities of the visual arts, and that the Catholic churches are the ones truly behind the progress of the visual arts at this time. So in a way, they're using it as propaganda to push their agenda. And the reformers, the Protestant reformers in Northern Europe, are going to do the same thing. They're going to use the visual arts as a propaganda to push their secular, more boots on the ground kind of worship of God as well. So they'll do that, and the Catholic Church is going to be very ornate and decorative in nature, and they're going to use those techniques during this Baroque time. Okay. Now there are three main, I talked about complexity and drama, but there are three main components that you're going to see throughout this Baroque period. At least here in Italy and Spain. One is going to be very dynamic, and that means that the angles of the sculptures or of the paintings and the narratives are going to sharply change to give you very quick, dramatic gestures, almost like implied motion. So if they're going to create artwork that looks like it's constantly in motion and that there's not a lot of time for rest. We're going to see that in the sculpture. We're going to see that even in the architecture and certainly in the painting. It's going to be theatrical. And we'll start with figure 24.1, Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Theresa. And if you look at that, just click on it and you look at the overall image, it looks like it's a staged performance. You even have sculptures of saints that are over to the side, the left and the right of the wings of the sculpture, that look as if they're watching this ecstasy of St. Theresa. And the story of the ecstasy of St. Theresa is that she was a Catholic nun and that she was struck in the heart with ecstasy after seeing an angel who expounded information to her about the presence of God and in the Catholic churches. So she became a canonical figure given sainthood by the papacy in the 1600s, the 17th century, and this sculpture is a sculpture on her behalf. So this is almost like a performance. It's like you look at this sculpture, this whole altarpiece, and you look at the sculpted components of the figures on the left and the right, viewing the ecstasy in the center, which is the angel pulling the arrow out of the heart of St. Theresa. And it's a visual display. It's theatrical. You're like part of the theater. Again, this is a big part of Baroque, is to have this theatrical-like definition behind it, as well as the dynamic definition. So we talked about dynamicism, which is the dynamic aspect. We talked about the theatrical. And if you go back to the primary and you see all of these rays of light coming down in the center upon the angel and St. Theresa, that's the dynamic shift between these highlighted golden features of these rays coming down upon the maneuvering and the shifting of the figures in the center, being the angel and St. Theresa. And it's obviously theatrical, like we just talked about. And the last is elaborate ornamentation, like huge levels of ornamentation. You can see that there's layers of painting that's overlapping the architecture. The architecture's coming out towards you. The sculptures look as if they're floating in space around this level of ornamentation. The sculpted relief figures of the saints on the left and the right look as if they're infused into the architecture. So this constant movement of ornamentation and expanding space is a big part of the Baroque period. So real quick, we're going to talk about Italy and we're going to talk about Spain in this chapter. We'll see how far we get in here with Italy with this verse video. We might have to cut it in half and then continue with it and then finish with Spain. But with the Italian Baroque, it was developed to re-centralize dominance of the Roman Catholic and the papal zeal for the Counter-Reformation, which I talked about. And so essentially what that means is during the 1600s, they were trying to re-centralize their dominance in the southern European areas. And they used Spain, or Spain was a big part of that re-centralization of dominance because the Spanish kings were Catholic. So anything that they did, and they had the biggest military, they were the most expansive. The Spanish were the ones who sent Columbus and Magellan and others across the Atlantic Ocean, and they found their way over to what was considered the New World, or into the Caribbean islands, and then ultimately down into Brazil. And the Portuguese became part of that as well, because Spain absorbed the Portuguese and the Netherlands during its height of its kingdom. So all of these components of Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, New Spain, and Italy, and the papacy were all kind of one unit. They were separate, but they all worked together. And so the papacy will use the strength of the shoulder of Spain to really re-centralize its dominance, and that's why we couple Italy and Spain together in this one chapter, because they're kind of the same team, if you will. So you have the religious team of the papacy in Italy with the Pope and the Catholic Church, and then you have the brawn, if you will, of Spain kind of working side by side. Okay, so we're talking about Bernini's Ecstasy of Saint Theresa. And if you zoom in, there's a couple other things. You're going to see that there's an increase of emotion, lots of facial psychological emotion in even the face of the angel, as well as Saint Theresa herself. If you look at the apostles or the disciples on the side, you'll see that they have lots of different emotions that are relating to the vision and the activity of Saint Teresa seeing the angel. There's constant motion, like always, something's always in motion. No matter where you look, there's some level of organic curve that's giving, or a diagonal line that's giving a sense of emotion or motion. For example, you look at those rays again above the angel, they're coming down in diagonals. They're not coming down straight down. So that gives it this effulgence, or this open diagonal glow coming from the heavens, which is again a sense of implied motion coming from the celestial realm versus the temporal realm. So this is a vision of the Catholic nun. Okay, I talked about this, and we talked about the architecture and the painting and how it's all working together. Okay, so now let's move on to some of the architectural features of Bernini, because he wasn't just a sculptor, he was a painter and he was an architect as well. So figure 24.4, St. Peter's, an aerial view. And what Bernini did here is he finished the colonnades. And what the colonnades are is those two half circles that you see, almost like open arms, and that's intentional. I'll talk about that here in just a second. So the two half circles, and you see all the series of columns that are going all the way around that half circle in the front as well as in the back, and then a couple in the center. Those are called colonnades. Colonnades. So when you have a series of columns side by side that continue from point A to point Z, that's called a colonnade. It doesn't matter if it is a curved colonnade or a straight colonnade. In the Greco-Roman times, they used straight linear colonnades, but here they used a series of curved colonnades. And the reason that they use the curved colonnades is because this is what the Catholic Church wanted. They wanted it to give it a sense of dramatic entrance, all right, which again is very Baroque, dramatic and complex. And it's very complex as an architect to set up a series of curved colonnades and make them symmetrical, especially since they're separated and you have that plaza in the center with the fountain that opens up the St. Peter's almost like it's this embrace. And that's why they made it dramatic and complex. So it looks as if you're walking into the arms of the Catholic Church, or you're walking into the arms of the Pope. So by them being curved like that, it's almost like your hands are being curved to go and embrace someone else. So that's why it was intentionally designed that way. And that's what makes it Baroque, is it has that dramatic sense of embrace. And that increases a level of warmth, all right, a metaphoric warmth. So you got to realize that the papacy at this time, behind the scenes, they're out there really pushing those reformers back, even to the point of death. But at the same time, they want to present that if you are a follower of the Catholic Church, you're going to receive the most warmth as possible. So they're trying to, in a way, they're trying to reconvert people subliminally through these Baroque levels of drama, and trying to increase warmth through these dramatic architectural constructions and sculptures. But at the same time, if you resist, they're going to send their Spanish the brawn of the Spanish Inquisition towards you and try to convert you forcefully. So there's a lot going on at this time. I'm not going to lie and say that it's all hunky-dory. It's not. You got to realize that the Catholics and the Protestants are fighting for like almost 100 years against each other. That's a long time. Okay, so now let's see what Bernini is a very important component of Italian Baroque, obviously, because we're going over a lot of his stuff. What he did inside of the Vatican, and that's figure 24.5, and it's called the Baldachanyo, and it's 100 feet tall, and it has a function and it has a function to it, and it's also symbolic, so it has both. And Baldachanyo is it is what it is. It's a pillar system, a 4-point pillar system that is emphasizing the altar, the main papacy altar in the Vatican. Okay, in St. Peter's. Okay, so this is the main altar place in which the Pope performs his ritualistic worships for the Catholic Church. So it frames the altar, and not only does it frame the altar of activity for each pope that comes into position, or I should say that is voted into position, because if you recall, in the Sistine Chapel, that is where all the papacy ministers go in and they vote on who the next pope is going to be. So for example, the present Pope, Francis, was decided upon in the Sistine Chapel after who was the one before him? Well, there was Pope John II, and then Benedict. Then there was Benedict, and then it became Francis. So this is where the activities of the Pope actually happen. So it's not just that, but this is called St. Peter's, and it's called St. Peter's because this is supposedly where St. Peter is buried. So this is where Peter is buried in the Vatican. And this altar, the Baldachanyo, is actually hovering above the burial place of St. Peter, his tomb. This is essentially marking his tomb. And another function that it has is it bridges the marble on the floor to the vaulted ceilings. So these are the barrel vaulted ceilings that the Romans came up with during the height of the Roman Empire, where they took these catacomb archways, which were originally underground, and then they decided to start building these same techniques up above the ground, which gave a more expansive atmospheric volume in their architectural temples and structures. And so that barrel vault is that curve you see on the top. It's not a painting, it's actual architectural curve called a barrel vault. And the columns and the structure itself is meant to tie the marble of the floor and the marble of the pillars to the concrete and marble barrel vault that's on the top. So it unifies the space. So that's one of its physical functions. And these are Baroque versions of the columns that were originally made in Constantine's old St. Peter. So at the end of the Roman Empire, Constantine is the one who shifted the attention away from polytheism to believing in a singular one God, monotheistic. And he moved Rome, or the activities of Rome, from Rome to what would soon be called Constantinople, which is Istanbul, Turkey. And Constantinople became the new Rome. And the reason he did that is because he wanted to get closer to Jerusalem and Bethlehem, because he became a devout follower of Jesus. And that was his shift from the Roman interest in polytheism and paganism to monotheism and believing in God, in the singular God. And so when he moved, he had an old St. Peter's built. And the columns that we see here in this Baldachanyo is a reflection of the original columns that no longer exist in Old St. Peter's by Constantine. So it's giving a reinforcement of the importance of focusing on God, and one God in particular, that originated with the Roman Empire. So the papacy is a derivative of this old Roman Empire. So by using these types of spiral columns that Constantine originally wanted in St. Peter's, it's reinforcing the primary power of the papacy throughout history in Rome. So it's tying itself back to the original view that we need to become worshipers of a singular God and not of multiple gods. So it's intentionally built in that way to give that symbolic function to Roman history in connection with the papacy. So and it shows supremacy in the papal triumph of Christianity. So by building these huge bronze pillars, which are a feat in and of themselves, and they had to build each section like 3 feet, 4 feet, and then they would cast it in bronze, and then they would cast the next section. So if you zoom in, you can see it's segmented. All 4 columns are. It shows their supremacy by having these large columns. It's a symbolic, and also it's a metaphoric, as well as a physical, functional connection to their dominance in the view of focusing on a singular God throughout history. Okay. So how about let's talk about Bernini's David real quick, and then we'll have to stop there because a lot of this chapter is going to be about Bernini as well as Caravaggio and how Caravaggio influenced a lot of painters in Spain in particular. So let's finish up with in this video with Bernini's David, figure 24.6. And you all should know David by now because we've seen Donatello do David, we've seen Michelangelo do David, now we're looking at Bernini doing David, and there were a couple others that we saw as well. But there's a big difference in how David is portrayed here in this Baroque period versus that we saw during the Renaissance, with the early Renaissance with Donatello, and then with Michelangelo's high Renaissance version of David. And what Bernini did is, first and foremost, he made David asymmetrical. He's not symmetrical. You can't run a line down the middle and have both sides look even, like you can with really Michelangelo's David and also and Donatello's. And if it's not a straight vertical axis line that runs down the middle, it's a sine wave that we saw with both of the Davids of Michelangelo and Donatello. And that was a Greco-Roman thing. But here, there's no sine wave. It's like this constant curve that goes to the right of David. And that, again, is what makes it Baroque. It makes it dramatic, and it makes it complex and theatrical in nature. And you can look upon the body of David, and you can see, even in his face, that there's this grit of his lip, like he's in the midst of battle. And there's lots of other symbolic elements that make it very theatrical. But those are the two main features, that curve to his right, and then also that bite of his lip, like he's getting ready to knock down Goliath very, very soon. But what Bernini really did with the marble versus his predecessors is he made it look very flexible. It looks as if David is in motion. We're capturing time. And now that's another thing about the Baroque period. It makes it so dynamic, is that the artists are trying to capture this sense of movement in time and in space. And that's what he's doing very, very well. And he's doing it so well because he's able to make it look as if the marble is flexing, which is something it cannot do. As soon as you give any tensile strength, which means like cantilevering an arm out and then you push weight on it, it will crack and break. It's very brittle. It's a metamorphic rock. It's very, very brittle. But he's built it in a way where it looks flexible, which is, again, a signifier of this time, during this Baroque time, is to make material look dramatic and flexible. And then it gives facility and boldness because of that. He looks bold because he has that flexible curve moving to his left. He looks like he's getting ready to beat the shit out of Goliath. There's no question about it. I talked about the element of time where he's getting ready to attack, and we see the grit in the teeth and on the lip, and the angle again is asymmetrical. That's ASYMMETRIAL. And one other thing with the asymmetry is it makes it kinetic, makes it look like it's in motion. It's implied kinetic. All right, he's not actually moving, but visually and optically it looks like he is moving and getting ready to shift. And one thing is with Bernini, he's showing him in actual combat, right? He's not before the combat, it's not after the combat, he's in it. And what other better way to emphasize the Baroque period than to actually show something in action? So a lot of historians have mentioned that Bernini's is the best because it's showing what's getting ready to happen after Michelangelo's and just before what happened with Donatello's. Bernini's is like that captured second in between Michelangelo's David and Donatello's David. It's kind of like the bridge between the two. So Bernini is known as the Bridge David, who kind of bridged all three of them together. One thing that they do call this is a psalmist, Psalmist, and that does come from the book of Psalms. And the reason that they call him that is because he is not going to use the armor that King Solomon has given to him. It is at his feet, and it's used as a base to hold his body for the sculptural purposes, but he's not using it in the element of Psalms because of his faith to God. He knows that he doesn't need that armor. All he needs is that all he needs is that stone and faith, and that's it. So the angle, real quick, imparts that dynamic quality of the Baroque period, and so I kind of talked about that a little bit already. So again, you have that dynamic, that theatrical and elaborate ornamentation. So the elaborate ornamentation is the armor that he chooses not to use because of the faith that he has in the Lord. And then also the theatrical is the curve that you see by making the marble look flexible. And the dynamic quality is also part of that angle and that grit that you see moving throughout his body. And he's engaging space around him. That's another thing. His body is slightly open. Remember in the last video we talked about closed form versus open form. And his body is his arms are open, his legs are open to give that sense of interacting with the space around you. So you're almost as if you're in the audience as in this theatrical moment where he's getting ready to engage that space in between him throwing that stone and with that sling upon the forehead of Goliath at a distance. Okay, I'll leave it at that, and we'll pick up with a little bit of architecture and then painting during the rest of the Italian Baroque, and then we'll move into Spain.